Good morning. There we go. So we're going to be in John chapter 11 for most of this morning. So if you want to leave your Bibles open there, and we're going to look at some events surrounding the resurrection of Lazarus. So I want to start off by welcoming our visitors. So echo what Bill said. We're so glad you're here this morning. We know time is a very precious commodity, and we cannot get it back. So the fact that you're spending this morning with us, we're extremely grateful. And we ask that you give us some time this morning to get to know you better. And to our new members, welcome. I've had a chance to meet this couple, and they're great people, and so I hope you all get a chance to meet them, and I know that you will welcome them into the congregation. So with that being said, to all you visitors, I am not the full-time minister. I'm not actually a minister either, so preparing for this lesson made me appreciate how much we are blessed to have two full-time ministers. We have Elisha on the left there, and then we have Charlie on the right, who's our youth minister. And they're both fantastic, and they do a lot for this congregation. So if you're visiting, I'd encourage you to come back when they're here. If you have children, especially try to get them involved, and you can talk to Charlie about that as well. I want to give a quick disclaimer, actually two. First one I just gave, I'm not the minister. The second one is the topic this morning is not taken for any reason in my life or something that I've observed in the congregation or something that is burning in my heart that I want to share with you all. It's something that I read in a Devo about 2.5, 3 years ago. And it's one of those things where it's just stuck with me. And so I always kind of put that in the back of my mind as if I ever have a chance to share this. It's a little too long for a Devo, maybe too short for a sermon, but it was something that I wanted to share with you. So just throw that out there. And then I will say this, it seems to be tradition that anytime someone comes up here and speaks who's not Elisha, they make some comment about not wanting to speak as long as Tom. And so I've always found Tom to be an excellent speaker, and I've always appreciated everything he says. So I went and asked him about this. I said, what's up with that? And Tom was very encouraging to me. He did say, you go as long as you want. But I just want to say that because, Tom, I really always appreciate when you come up here, and you mean a lot to this congregation, and you've been nothing but great to me and Savannah, and your whole family for that matter. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Tom. But I'm not going to go as long as I want. I'm going to try to do this in 20 minutes. So let's get into it then. So we have Jesus, the Son of God, and we know from the first chapter of John in the first verse that Jesus was with God in the very beginning, and Jesus is God. And so when we study the Gospels, we can learn from Jesus, knowing that he has the authority to speak and teach us many great things. And there's things about Jesus as God that we cannot relate to. We can read, we can learn, we can try to understand, but we cannot necessarily relate to that because he's God. We can't perform miracles like he can. We can't read the hearts of our fellow man. But Jesus was also a man just like you and me. He was born as a baby. He just didn't show up one day. He had birthdays. He had friends growing up. He had to learn to talk. All these things that he became the man that we read about in the Bible. And so this morning, I want to try to focus on something we can learn from him as man. So don't cheat and go down and look at this verse, but there's a verse that I know you all have memorized. And you may not know you have it memorized, but you do. But you may not know that it is actually chapter 11:35. But it's a very short verse, and it reads simply, Jesus wept. And so this weeping, as we're going to find out a little bit later, is not just shedding a tear. It is an outpouring of emotion. It is when your soul is troubled, and you are grieving, and there's just no holding back all your emotion. And so that's what Jesus does. And we're going to read about the events leading up to that and maybe take a lesson or two from that. So before we get into John, I am going to go back to Luke chapter 10. You don't have to turn there if you don't want to, but I always get Mary and Martha confused. So I know the story, but I always forget which one's which. So just so we can level set and we know who's who, we have Mary and we have Martha, and they invite Jesus over to his house. And Mary's the one who sat at Jesus' feet. And listened to his teachings. And this upset her sister because she was the one doing all of the hosting duties. So she kind of neglected that aspect of that. But Jesus defends her desire to learn. And then you have Martha, and I'm a Martha. I'm probably team captain of Martha. That I relate to her. And she's the one who is distracted by serving, and she's upset with her sister because she's not helping. And Jesus gently rebukes her. So now we know, just to get that straight, Mary and Martha. I'm going to do a quick recap of what we read. So I did want to read all those verses, so I do thank you for the long reading this morning. But just a few points to go over. We have Lazarus, who is the brother to Mary and Martha, and he's ill. He's just not ill, he's near death. And what we read is that Jesus loved all three. And Jesus loves everyone, right? We know this, but there is a relationship that has formed with this family. And so he's close to them. He's dined with them. We read that Mary anointed his feet. So this is just not an acquaintance. These are people that he knew and that he loved dearly. The sisters are worried, and they send word that their brother is sick. What does Jesus do? He delays his trip. He doesn't go immediately. And he explains this to his apostles. And the reason being is that he intends to raise Lazarus from the dead when he dies. And as he says this, Lazarus dies. But by doing this, he's delaying his trip, and the effect on Mary and Martha is that it leaves them worrying. And eventually they're going to be grieving alone for their brother. Jesus explains to the apostles what he's doing, but no explanation is sent to Mary and Martha. And then we'll read this here briefly. When he meets those sisters, and he meets them independently, they both say the very same thing to him. You see in verse 21 and verse 32, he says, they say, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Clearly, you can tell that they have a close relationship, because that's a pretty frank and bold thing to say to the Son of God. With Martha, he has a very deep theological conversation about never dying and being raised and being in heaven one day. But with Mary, it's very different. This is where we read that Jesus wept. So I'm going to try this and see if this... I'll save that for another day, because I feel like I'm not going to be that good at that. But I wanted to get a picture, and I'm channeling my Scott Woolens, because he usually comes up here and has some artwork done. And so I found this, and we'll just keep this up as I kind of summarize the events. So as I just said, he meets with Martha and has that conversation with her. And then he makes his way over to where Mary is. And when Mary sees him, she falls at his feet. And she's weeping herself, and she's troubled. There are Jews who came to comfort Mary and Martha, and they're weeping as well. And Jesus is in the center of this. And there's also other Jews who have come. Jesus is attracting a crowd, and there are some Jews there who say, "See, does Jesus really loved this family?" And others are cynical, and they say, "Well, if this man can make a blind man see, why couldn't he have done something to keep this man alive?" And Jesus is weeping too at this moment. And so they take him to where Lazarus is dead, or where Lazarus is buried, and he's been dead for 4 days. And Martha, the sister who's the one who was busy serving, I don't know if we call her practical, but the one who worries about the little things in life, she says, "Well, Lazarus is going to smell. He's been dead for 4 days." And Jesus says, "Don't worry." What he does is he prays to God and says, "Bring this man back to life so that others may believe." And that's exactly what happens. And so I'd encourage you to read through that story a little later today. That's verses 28 down to about verse 44. But those are the events, and we're going to focus primarily on the middle of that, around the events leading up to that verse that we talked about when Jesus wept. So why did Jesus weep? Let's read verses 32 through 35. So it's John chapter 11, starting in verse 32. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. We'll stop there. So if we kind of work our way backwards to the events leading up to the weeping of Jesus, we read that he's greatly troubled and he's moved in his spirit. Why? Well, he sees others weeping, others grieving. He sees the Jews who came to console Martha and Mary, and then he sees Mary weeping. And this is the same Mary that learned at his feet. And as the first thing she did was she came and fell at his feet. And as we said earlier, she tells Jesus, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. So why do we weep? Why do we have emotion? I'm going to, if you'll bear with me, give a little silly example here, and then we'll come back and answer that question more deeply. One of my favorite television shows is Seinfeld. I grew up watching it. It seems like it's always on TV. But if you know the show, there's a character, the lead character. His name is Seinfeld, played by Jerry Seinfeld. And he's not a very emotional person at all. And there's an episode where, through the series of events, he becomes in tune with his emotions. And I don't know if you can read this, but he actually sheds a tear and he cries. But this is so foreign to him. He says, what is this salty discharge? You and I would call this a tear. And so you can't really see it. There's another character to the right of him there. And she says, you're crying. And the whole quote is, what is this salty discharge? This is horrible. I care. He's a person who, doesn't really care. That's kind of part of his character. So why do we weep? Why do we have emotion? I mean, simply put, it's because we care, but there's a lot more to that. So why did Jesus weep? Well, clearly he has compassion for the family situation, especially for Martha, who's right at his feet, for Mary, who's right at his feet, and then, of course, the other sister, Martha. He's at the center of a very trying and difficult period for this family. And it's just not the two sisters. It's everyone else who's come to be with them and those who are following him. Have you ever been at the center of a very troubling time for someone or a family? You can't help but get emotional as well, especially when you're close to that person or that family. You can be overwhelmed. That old thing is, if you cry, I'm going to start crying. I won't go as far as to say that's what's happening here, but we as humans, we can relate to that, seeing pain in other people. And then there's this recognition from Jesus, what it's like to be a human. This is not a foreign concept to our God. The Son of God walked on this earth, interacted with fellow humans, knows what it's like to be a human, and recognizes the pain that's going on. And if you're going to sum it up in one word, it's empathy. So I'm going to share this, and I'm not going to speak too much about this, but there's an ad campaign. I won't say an ad campaign, but there's a campaign to get people to learn about Jesus and get them to study the Bible. And it's not from the Church of Christ, but you see it on commercials every now and then. There's billboards at baseball games behind home plate. If you look for it, it's kind of everywhere. But I found this, and it says, Jesus gets our lives because he was human too. And I think that's something that we often forget, is that we know Jesus loves us, but he understands how difficult life can be. He understands that sometimes it's hard to face the day. Even at the end of the day, when you're tired, it's hard to even go to bed because you know the next day may even be worse. And that's difficult. But this is something that is not foreign to our God. And it's because he lived as a human being. So I want us to remember that as well. Now we're going to get to the actual message of the Devo. So all that was a lead up. And so what you see in bold here is kind of the message from that Devo. And so here's what it was. Actually, we're not quite there yet. So we'll get there shortly. So we know that Mary and Martha were faithful to Jesus, and they were likely some of the closest people in his lives, just the way that they talked to him, that he was a guest at their house, and they're full believers in who he was. And not only who he was, but you know wholeheartedly that they believed that if Jesus was with them as they sent word for him to come, that their brother would not be there, or would not have died. So here's a question: was Jesus at fault? I don't think any of us would say that's the case. Jesus had a finite time on this earth and made the most of what he had as far as his time went. His public ministry lasted roughly 3 years, and he took advantage of every waking moment of the day. And so we know that he raises Lazarus. And if you read later on in the chapter 11, we read that the Jews are planning to kill Jesus. And so it reads in verse 53, so from that day on, they made plans to put him, that's Jesus, to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews. I think if you have the New Living Translation, it says something to the effect that Jesus' public ministry ended on that day. So the time of his impact on this earth was running out, and he was making the most of his time. And that's why he delayed. And he told the apostles that very reason, so that they may believe. And just to give you an idea of how stressful the time was for Jesus and his ministry, we read in chapter 12 that these same Jews want to take action against the person that Jesus raised from the dead. It reads, so the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Jesus was a threat to the Jewish leaders at the time, and his life was endangered, and he was running out of time. So was Jesus at fault? I don't think we would say that, not at all. So now we get to the message of that Devo, and this is what it read. You can do everything right and still cause pain to those you care deeply about. And that struck me. And the way, if I may just kind of rewrite that, or how I interpret it, is you don't have to do anything wrong and still cause pain to those you care about. Now, if you stop paying attention, I don't want you to leave this morning and think that if people around you are in pain that, it's not something that you've done, because there are times that you are going to do things that are going to cause people pain. But you can think of at least a handful of times in your life, I know I can, about a situation where people are in pain and they're looking at you and you've done nothing wrong. You may have not done what they wanted you to do, or you may have different priorities, but what you did was not your fault, and how they feel is not your fault. So what do we do as men, as women? I feel like this is probably something more men do. I feel like I do it, and this is why this always struck with me, and something I struggle with, and something that I want to get better at, is what does a man do? What do we do? Well, first of all, we deny that something is our fault to even begin with. And we spend a lot of time making sure that person understands that this is not my fault. I'm sorry for what's going on, but this is not my fault. And the idea is, if I can prove that I've done nothing wrong, well, it cannot be my fault. And what we're really doing is we're acting with our head and not our heart. What does Jesus do? This is the lesson we can learn from him this morning. We've already said he was innocent of any wrongdoing, but he recognizes the pain. I think, for the most part, we can tell when someone's in pain, but he doesn't protest. He certainly doesn't explain. Now's not the time to explain. He empathizes, and he immediately does what he can to make things better. And that's what I want us to walk away with this morning, is whether you are the cause of the pain, it doesn't really matter. You may find yourself in a situation where you think it's unfair, but that's beside the point. We as Christians are called to reflect his love every moment of our life. And so we can empathize, and we can do what we can to make things better, just like Jesus. I'm going to leave you with this verse, and then we're going to be done for this morning. And I'll give kudos to Alan. Alan said he would try to find songs that match my lesson, and his first song was specifically about this verse, so A+. So thank you. And I'll read this. This is from the New Living Translation, Hebrews chapter 12, starting at the end of verse 1. And let us run with the endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. So we serve a living God. Jesus is at the right hand of God right now. If you read earlier chapters in Hebrews, it talks about the great high priest, and that's Jesus. And it basically says what we have through Jesus is so much better than the old covenant. And he's our advocate for us. And remember, he knows what it's like to be a human. He knows what it's like to be tempted in every way with sin. He knows what it's like to walk in a world that has fallen because of sin. So oftentimes we may not feel like we're in a right place with God to go to him in prayer. Let us not think like that, because we have an advocate for us, and that's Jesus, who understands what it's like to live on this earth. But we know life is not going to be easy. It's not promised to be easy. Even when we're baptized and become a Christian, it's not as if all our troubles in the world go away. That isn't the case. In many ways, things can be more challenging because you may face persecution, you may face ridicule, people may mock you, but that's okay. And it's okay because we have each other, and God understands that this is going to be a hard race to run. And when we're ever troubled or when we need some help, let us go to the Word and look at Jesus and look at the example that we have before us. He's the perfecter of our faith. He's the perfect example that we have. And we have the same joy that awaits him. We have the same joy that he has with God that will await us one day when the end is upon us. And so I just ask and pray that we all look to each other for help when we're in pain, and then when we see that pain, let us first empathize. And sometimes we don't have to say anything. Just be there and give a hug and help our fellow man and help our fellow Christian. And so we're about to have a song. We're about to have an invitation. So if you have any need for the congregation, we ask that you come forward. If you're not a Christian and you've been thinking about it, why not today? If it's a matter of being baptized, we can do that. If it's just a matter of starting a Bible study and asking more questions and getting answers to things that you would want to know, we can start that as well. Whatever your need is, please come forward as we stand and sing.